Well, Dr. Mestenhauser, we've discussed the role of culture in internationalization and international education in our earlier conversations and a little bit today, too. Can you explain how culture is addressed or understood by the academic disciplines, please?
Yeah, that's one of the key issues, I think, in international education. My own approach is a systems-oriented approach, and in that system, culture is the key variable. Not just a variable; it's more than that. It's an operating program for your brain, and the reason it is because you have lived in the culture for a long time. That's why we have problems with immigrants, because they don't have that kind of a program in their minds as yet, too. And if you live long enough in a culture, your mind gets organized to reflect that culture. Somebody always objects, how come you explain that there are a lot of differences within a culture? Well, it's essentially an effort to maintain the culture. It's a safety valve for a culture to have many differences within it. And some of the differences are true the same way in other cultures. And so in comparative thinking, for example, this would be interesting to take that into account. My own conclusion to this effect came when I started visiting Japan, and that goes way back to 1961 when I finished my PhD. I was actually there for the State Department to help organize the Fulbright Commission, which didn't exist because the exchange with the Japanese was dominated by the military occupation government, and they weren't doing a very good job. The military really failed miserably in Europe as well, too, at the time. I never forget my first experience with one of these Germans who came as a result of a program for democratization of these people. And they showed me a copy of a contract they had to sign before they came. The contract required them not to borrow money, not to marry American girls, and things like that. It was just unbelievable. So anyway, my conception of culture, then, having been the central one to it, is the one that's most misunderstood. Because it's abstract. It's an abstraction. You don't see it, you don't touch it. And so as a result of that, the people who are oriented to any kind of behavioral tradition and so on would not relate to this kind of a concept at all. So they have to translate it to specific behavior that they can see and observe. And that's, of course, missing a lot of things, too. So I think the culture is needed. There was a very interesting book written by Professor Ross, Norbert Ross, I think is his name. He used to be at Minnesota many years ago, and I remember meeting him at the time. Then he left after about 1 or 2 years, and I think he's at Vanderbilt or someplace in Tennessee. And he wrote a book which is called Culture and Cognition.
Oh, okay.
And that, because he was a cognitive psychologist who got intrigued by the possibility of getting all the brain sciences, cognitive sciences together into a kind of a super science, super field. It didn't work, apparently, but he encountered anthropology at that particular point. And so he was very intrigued by that, and he took his sabbatical to study just that, cultural and cognitive anthropology, and concluded that there are 7 major differences between the cognitive traditions that he knew and cognitive tradition from anthropology. And one of them, of course, is that in cognitive psychology, they seek universal truth. And that's why, for example, all these instruments that are produced are influenced by that kind of cognitive psychology.
Right.
And immediately they try to market them abroad, so practically before the instrument is finished, you already have a Japanese translation and so on. And so that's a mistaken idea, because the Japanese who get that kind of a question don't necessarily answer the questions that are being asked.
Right.
They have their own way of seeing what the question might mean.
Yeah.
And in thinking about answering, they probably would be looking to answer it the way that the researcher wants to hear, and so on. And so it's a problem. The other way that Ross states the difference is how culture is being treated in research, particularly. Most of them is looking at culture as one of many variables. And even then, for example, culture may be treated as independent variable, which is the most common approach to it, rather than dependent variable. And Ross's conclusion is that, of course, you reach misleading conclusions, when you use different. The worst one, of course, is that you treat culture simply as a context in which it happens.
Right.
The early cross-cultural communication people were subject to this kind of critique. They assumed that the communication theory works everywhere because everywhere people communicate. And so the culture was only the context in which this communication happened. So, that's the sort of the conceptual way of explaining the role of culture out here. But there is another conclusion that Ross made, and that one is confusing most people, I guess, too. He says that the more specific you get, like studying behavior, for example, the more it looks not like culture, but like social psychology or political science and so on. He calls that the fading aspect of culture. And that's the problem that we have, is because people do not conceptualize on several different levels of abstraction. And culture is that, it functions in all levels of abstraction, from your values and to your mindsets to your, to your opinions and so on, to even to your knowledge, and then finally comes culture. So that's one of the things, because it teaches you, essentially a flexible way of thinking about this, and that requires also a making of cognitive shifts from one level to another one, or one culture to another one. And that is very difficult, again, for Americans, because we are told basically to get to the bottom of things precisely, and have only one answer.
Right.
And you reduce that to... that's the consequence of that for us is great, because once you make a decision, you have forgotten about other options. They don't exist anymore. Surprisingly, however, some research shows that women do.
Sure.
And so there is an explanation for the large number of female students who go abroad. And people don't recognize that. I don't think I have seen an answer to that kind of an issue. But the way that you look at culture is something that you don't really understand or acquire unless you have really exposed yourself to it. And I think just reading books and so on is inadequate, although extremely helpful. And there's a lot of handbooks, how to work with the Japanese. I have 2 or 3 books about the Japanese that are really outstanding and one of them is written by an Englishman, another one by the Japanese, not by an American.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the major books about Japan has been written before World War II
Mm-hmm.
by a philosophy professor by the Nakamura.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And American military discovered the book after the occupation of Japan,
After.
1945, because it was published then in Japanese, had it translated quickly, and it became a bestseller by the University of Hawaii Press. It's called, let's see, The Ways of Thinking of Oriental Peoples. And he has 4 chapters in it. Half of the book is about the Japanese. Then he talks about Korean, Indian, and Chinese, the other 3 chapters. And I'm just so impressed by that book, how quickly and deeply he has understood this issue of the Japanese culture itself.
Yeah.
Japanese don't look at themselves as a culture, basically, but he did, and it's philosophical, and it's just very, very good book. But it's, most people get turned off by the philosophy of it, and so they don't read it. But I think it should be a required reading, I think of people. I was going to make another point in connection with Ross, but I can't think of it now. I'll come back to it a little later, I guess.
Sure. So beyond the book learning, you were also going to allude there were some other pieces too. So people should read and obviously understand books like Nakamura. What are the other components that that you would suggest as well in order to gain more exposure to culture? What types of activities should they have?
Well, first of all, you have to have an open mind to see things, and when you encounter something that's different, that ought to trigger you to thinking about why it's different and what caused it to be so different. When I was taking faculty people to Kyrgyzstan, particularly, that was the most different culture that we encountered. And I used to have kind of debriefing seminars, and I would ask, well, did you notice so-and-so? Did you notice so-and-so? And at one point somebody commented, well, how come you see so many things and we don't? Well, I have bigger eyes and bigger mind, because everything is an expression of that culture. So, it's important to understand that too. The books there are, I think, are again, most of them are generally, in line with this idea that everything is universal. But, I think you really need to get some meaningful books about specific countries too. And, I have these 2 sources on Japan that I mentioned to you. And I think there is one very good one on China recently published. Can't think of any other that I would recommend because I mostly worked in Japan. And, just to give you an example of how misleading things are, it's not just the concept of culture, but how the culture is organized itself too. And it relates to a book which is called, let's see, I can't think of the title offhand too. Anyway, he had a chapter about General Mills. And General Mills discovered that there is a big market for their products in Japan. So they sent a big shipment of cake mixes. because they discovered that the Japanese like cakes and that they use a lot of cakes and spend a lot of money on cakes. But it didn't move, didn't go. So they sent somebody to, that was a result, incidentally, of market research that was done typically in an American fashion.
Right.
And so they sent another researcher out there, and he discovered why they don't buy these cake mixes. The reason was that people don't have ovens to make the cakes. As most Japanese is based on the top stoves, you know.
Right. So you can't have this.
So this would not attract them, however, and they decided, well, we have to find other ways too, and they discovered that everybody does have rice cookers. And so they went back to the laboratory and developed a new model of a cake mix, and again shipped it up to Japan, and again it didn't sell. So they sent another guy there to figure it out what happened. And the answer was also very simple. The the rice cookers were busy all day and all night.
They couldn't be used.
Because, you know, that's what most people do in Japan, you know, make a great big pot of rice and eat it all the time.
Well,
so they eventually fired the vice president who was manager of that too, and I was giving a talk one time in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and somebody got up there when I explained this story out here, how the culture, understanding even how the culture is organized is important. He said, "Is his name so-and-so?"
No,
and I said, "Yes, how do you know?" "He's my brother-in-law." So I think he understood that he got fired. I don't know what happened to him. But you see the persistence that was shown in the American way of, don't give up, keep going, and so on. You know, that was typical American. That was, our own culture, our own behavior is something that we have to take into account. And when you speak about culture, we need to understand our own culture. And that is also a very grim story, because our students do not understand anything, and whatever they have been taught in high school, they had forgotten by now. Even the names of presidents, and they couldn't even place states on the blind map of the U.S. and things like that. So it really is dismal. This creates a major question, for example, whether you need to understand your own culture first before you understand another one, or the opposite. I don't take sides in this argument out here, because both of them are valid. You go to another culture, you get essentially confronted with certain things, and so you take that into account in your cognitive structure and so on. The other way is, of course, preferable, because when you go abroad, some orientation program and so on about American society is needed. And that's one of the reasons, for example, why in the future organization, for example, I would like to see just a one-credit course required of students about American culture. The field that promised to do this was the American Studies, but now they're completely studying only the modern American studies and popular culture, so. And it's not easy, because most faculty people specialize too highly. I recall when we used to have a serial of contracts with the government about orientation centers for incoming Fulbright scholars. And we found out that they knew about the U.S. culture much more than we expected. But we also had a problem finding a professor who would take, and I think we had about 10 hours available in the 6-week course, 4 lectures about American culture.
Okay. Okay.
And 2 of the professors that we selected just didn't fit. Just couldn't handle it.
Right. Right.
You know, they started it out, you know, with the early history, the Pilgrims, and ended up with the Civil War and didn't go beyond that.
Right. That essential
So, yeah,
effects
so,
of these events and how.
So
they
there
affect
were
society.
2 other professors. David Noble was one of
Mhm.
them, and Clark Chambers was the other one. They understood what we were doing. They did a lot of thinking, and they really presented American culture, the whole culture, from a total historical and social perspective.
Okay.
So it's if you were going to do this, you know, you need to train the faculty how to teach that
Right.
kind of a course.
Yeah.
Faculty generally don't respond to what they call survey courses. They think they are cheap, and they don't really show the great detail, you know, because
Right.
you really go into the bottom of things, and that takes time. That's why our curriculum is so fragmented into smaller departments and so on.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mestenhauser.
Okay.